welcome everyone to the Capital Mind podcast. If you'd like to know more about us, visit capitalmind.in. And if you'd like to invest with us, do visit capitalmindwealth.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as the basis for investment decisions. Clients of Capital Mind may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 35, I think, of the Capital Mind podcast. Gravity existed temporarily, but the stock markets have ignored it and once again begun their irresistible upward move. But we're here today because the budget for the ages that happened actually has been very interesting. And so we've brought in Deepak today to talk about government debt, borrowing, GDP, inflation, and how this impacts your investment opportunities. Everything ranging from your, EPF not looking all that desirable anymore, to you now having access to government securities directly and a change in how you may choose to invest your money going forward. So, Deepak, welcome. And I guess let's get started. So, look, as expected, we had our budget. It's the year post the COVID crisis, or we're still kind of in it, and borrowing has gone up. So, can you give us an understanding? I mean, have we just really increased the borrowing a lot, and what's happening with that?
Yeah, I think, firstly, thanks, Shray. This is a welcome start to a Capital Mind podcast 2021. I think, the government borrowing, and just to give an example of how crazy the situation is, we wanted to borrow only about 6 or 7 lakh crores last year. That is, government borrows because it spends more than it earns. And when it does, the difference happens to be a certain number. It's called the fiscal deficit. And we finance the fiscal deficit by borrowing. So last year, that number was supposed to be 7 lakh crores of borrowing. And now we're talking of 12 lakh crores. Now, the deficit itself is 15 lakh crores. Part of that deficit is going to be borrowed from small savings. What they call small savings fund is essentially your PPF and national savings certificates and post office deposits and so on. These are called small savings. Small savings are a big source, in a sense, an interesting source. They were budgeted to be last year about 2.5 lakh crores. They actually ended up borrowing 4.8 lakh crores from small savings. And this next coming year, they're saying, okay, it'll be 4 lakh crores. That's the amount that the government will get financed by post office deposits and PPF and so on. Now, there's an interesting point about this, and we'll come to that in terms of how that has come about. But the rest of the borrowing is coming from the markets. This 12 lakh crores of gross borrowing. Gross is when I say gross, it's new securities that will be issued. But some securities will get paid back which were issued earlier. So what was borrowed in 2010 as a 10-year bond will now mature. So they'll have to pay those back. So the gross borrowing will be 12. The net borrowing will be about 9.5 or so. So about 2.5 lakh crores of repayments that are happening. This is quite a big number. And, that's the size of the GDP is about 195 lakh crores as of now.
But is that with that temporary 24% fall? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the 24% is actually a fall compared to the last quarter. So it's a quarterly GDP fall, right? So effectively 200 lakh crores fell to 194 lakh crores. And we'll get the new numbers end of this month. So it'll probably be 195. So let's say 200 lakh crores. 200 trillion. Effectively, 1 lakh crore is a trillion. So of that, the government is freshly going to borrow around 5%.
Just under 6, right?
Just under 6. 6 gross, 5 net is how much they're going to borrow. This is not an incredibly huge amount considering it's been a corona year, you've had so much displacement and so on. But that actually talks to you about what they're really not doing, which is not much. I mean, they're not doing much. They're just rejigging a lot of the expenditure to make it a little more transparent. So earlier we used to hide that expenditure in other places, and now we're actually showing it. So
okay, that actually is a great segue into my next question. So fine, 12 lakh crores, we get the number. It isn't actually, as you said, a very high number in some ways. So where are we spending it? And I think here you have some points that you're not very happy with where we're spending it.
Yeah, I mean, I think to an extent where, you would say that the corona's displaced us, created a lot of issues and stuff like that. There's two kinds of expenditure really. Some expenditure will help people survive. So you could look at a food subsidy as something that helps people survive. It means the government buys food from the farmers when they otherwise may not have other places to sell it. So it gives them a guaranteed payment, but the government may not be able to use the food, so it rots. So that is a food subsidy, which doesn't help everybody, but it helps one set of people, the farmers. Despite whatever was said, we've spent 4.5 lakh crores last year. This is much more than the 2 lakh crores or so budgeted, or less than 2 lakh actually. So we've spent more than 2x the amount we budgeted on buying food from farmers. They're not going to use all that food, and a lot of it is going to go to rot, but that's fine because farmers get paid in a time when the whole supply chains were short. So
So I guess why you don't like it is you're spending this money to keep these folks afloat. So to that extent, you achieve one objective, but then not much more beyond that.
yeah, so if you think of it as expenditure that has to be done, because if you stop it, then too many people will,
It'd be
have
terrible.
trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're doing that. So subsidies from fertilizers to food to kerosene are those kind. Then there is interest payments. Now, what we don't realize is of the 34 lakh crores that we are spending next year, going to spend next year, 8 lakh crores, 25% of it is going to be only to pay interest on the money we've already borrowed.
Ouch.
That is crazy to an extent because we have about 110 lakh crores of
Debt.
government borrowing in total. We're paying 8%. The government is paying 8%. You and I would kill to get 8%, but obviously somebody's getting 8%. So the government is actually paying 8%.
That just sounds too high.
It's ridiculously high. And to the extent that, it dwarfs everything else. The next highest single layer of expenditure is defense, which is 3.5 lakh crores.
So less than half of interest payments.
Yes, and that's revenue expenditure, for not capital. But
Got it.
let's assume that the expenditure just on defense, which is to about 30 or 40% more or less required because you need to defend the nation, but some of it is also going to be useful in the future in terms of research, because whatever the defense does, it actually creates infrastructure for further civilian work. So for instance, if the defense builds a bridge, that doesn't mean the bridge is completely useless. Tomorrow civilians will use the bridge and perhaps use it for commerce as well. So there's some part of defense expenditure. The whole internet, by the way, was a defense expenditure item that started off as that, and now look where it's come. So that was the US defense. But in India also, there's a lot of stuff that the defense uses that will become useful.
Goa airport.
Contentious to say whether it's a good
Let's
thing or
move
a
on.
bad.
Let's move on. Let's move on.
So, but interestingly, the rest of it, for instance, defense for subsidies become one of the biggest expenditure items after defense. So the first one is a waste. The second one is okay, well, half good, half just required. The third one is again a required, not good kind of item. So you're ending up spending more than half of the government expenditure on stuff that's okay. We spend a fraction of this on health, which is actually beneficial because it will help people be healthy and productive. On education, which is obviously productive in the later years. So on the stuff that will yield us great returns. On infrastructure, we're spending a fair bit this time, about 2 lakh crores, 2 lakh odd crores on at least the big items of infrastructure. The interesting thing about that is what's going to give us great returns in the future. And we're spending relatively smaller amounts on that versus everything else. So the quality of the expenditure is not huge. One thing that they have done this year is taken out some of the hidden items. So for instance, they've said, listen, we're spending 2.5 lakh crores on food subsidies. So you look at that and say, hey, this was, I know it's 4.4 lakh crores last year, which was much higher. But earlier than that, it was just 1 lakh crores. So how come we're spending 2.5 times? The answer was they were already spending 2 lakh crores. But except that the Food Corporation of India, which typically buys the food from the farmers, would then go borrow the food from the small savings fund.
It's money from the small savings fund.
So the small savings fund would get about 4 lakh crores and give 1 lakh crores to FCI, and the remaining 2.5, 3 lakh crores it would give to the government. So now the government saying, listen, forget this farce. Let's just take more money directly from the small savings fund and give it to the FCI.
So this cleans up the books a bit so that there's fewer, if I may say, compartmentalized things which you don't get visibility into.
Yes. And so we'll borrow less from the market relatively and borrow more and give more to the FCI, but that doesn't change much. So some elements of this change in the next 1 year are just cleaning up the books and making it straightforward. Some of it is, of course, required new expenditure. We're going to spend a lot on the vaccine. I think they put budget about 35,000 crores. They might end up spending more than that on the vaccines. But this is actually not a budget where you're saying the government's going all out and spending like crazy. They are doing very interesting things. They are, so if you look at the good expenditure, there is a tremendous amount of interesting things that are happening. So roads, for instance, they're building more roads. But let's take one example of how government spending can actually be good. Today, you have trains that travel on tracks, and those tracks are designed to be, there'll be two tracks, one track for one way and the other track for the other way. And these are the same tracks carrying both mail and passenger trains. So mail meaning goods trains or
Freight, I guess.
freight.
Yeah.
The problem with this is that the goods trains are enormously bulky. They have certain compartments which you have to stuff your things in. And if you don't have the compartments, you have an empty thing on which you might have a truck made to stand, which then helps the truck go from one place to the other faster. They take the same lines as passenger trains. So when passengers are obviously more important. So when a passenger train comes by behind you, the mail trains are relatively slower. You have this mail train that's put into a sidelined, a side track, and then the passenger train passes, and only then does the mail train come back on. So mail trains take long amounts of time. Then they use the same platforms as the passenger trains. Passenger train platforms are not very long, so, and also they're not very conducive to unloading goods. So you end up with this suboptimal place where you might have a few bogies that cannot be unloaded on the main train. You have to move the train a little bit for them to be unloaded and so on. Then the last one is, there a lot of it is that the because passenger trains don't tend to travel to ports
Yeah.
quite that often. The connectivity to ports is patchy, and therefore ports are also where goods come in. So that's where goods need to be moved. So the scheduling becomes all complicated between passenger and mail and all that stuff. To avoid some of this, the government has anyway said, listen, we need a dedicated freight corridor, which means two separate lines, one for going, one for coming back, which will carry only freight trains. What this does is quite dramatic. They've not only done this, they've also said we will have a completely new architecture. The size and the height of trains today can carry a bogie and a little bit. So it's like maybe 15 feet. That's about the size of your train. To accommodate these tunnels, maybe at 20 feet, 25 feet long. I don't know. I'm just making a guess. What they've done with this is with the freight corridor, said, no, we've got to think again.
Okay.
Let's assume that there are mail trains that carry only freight.
Okay.
I mean, goods trains that carry only freight. Why should we have bogies? Just have containers. Your standard shipping containers can be dropped straight onto the train. You can have 2 kilometer long trains with multiple engines in the middle that give it energy, and you can have this travel at a fair speed because there's only mail trains traveling on a track. You can schedule many more mail trains. Now the last part is they're going to double stack these. That means there'll be one container on top of the other, much higher in height compared to a regular train. So you get something that is now a completely new architecture that can carry a massive amount of freight, and they're connected straight to ports. So the Western Dedicated Freight Corridor will go from JNPT, I think, in Bombay, across to Gujarat, where there are a bunch of ports. And then they will connect onwards to Delhi. The idea here is that the ports will generate the container traffic, which can then be transported to Delhi or somewhere in the middle. There will be completely different platforms for this, which are more conducive to loading and unloading of freight with cranes and so on. This changes the game because now suddenly you have a lot more traffic that can be carried beyond the trucking system. Trucks are slow. Trucks have a relatively lower amount of volume that they can carry. They have this whole, I have to wait and crossing state levels. I have to get inspected for GST and so on. Also, uh, one single train, think of it as 2 kilometers, can probably carry as much as, I don't know, 400 or 500 trucks now, especially if double stacked. So you can get a lot more done. So what you're doing is creating a productivity benefit.
So this is, if I may, and to belabor the point even more, the issue is that productivity. This is where, I mean, you really would like the government spending to go to, because this will yield tremendous benefits going forward to everyone.
Yes. So think about the benefits of I have perishable stuff in Bombay that
Yes.
needs to be transported to Delhi.
Yeah.
Today I won't transport it because trucks take 12 days.
Yeah.
But if a dedicated freight corridor gives me an ability to reach Delhi in one day, I have the ability to say, listen, let's do it. If we can do something like that, you can increase the productivity of a lot of things. That means prices will come down because availability is a problem. And I was talking about this recently. I have talked about it on a bunch of podcasts and stuff where, there was my average shoe budget was, let's say, 4,000 rupees a year. And I would go and buy. I'm not very fancy, but there are these comfortable shoes that I like to buy. And earlier there used to be these branded ones like an Adidas or a Nike or something like that. They would cost more than four sometimes. It was okay because those shoes lasted you a couple of years and so on. But on Amazon or Flipkart, one of those two places, I noticed recently that we had a shoe available for 400 rupees. And it looks pretty good. And I said, okay, let me get it. And it was there, it was comfortable, and I bought more than one of them. But even if I had bought more than one of them, my budget for shoes, if you may, I don't have a budget, but I'm just saying how much I spent, was about 25% of what it was, which means all if you did was to improve the infrastructure of getting something across to me, you've reduced prices. And if that can happen with Flipkart and Amazon, what happens with the dedicated freight infrastructure? Things change dramatically for prices. So your increasing infrastructure availability actually helps reduce prices and increase availability. So your demand may remain the same. In fact, the demand may go up now. Suddenly, it's like if a factory was going to get started somewhere close to Delhi, it couldn't get raw material on time. Suddenly, it can restart operations because it's getting that raw material on time and getting enough of it. It's able to send its finished goods also by the same route. So a lot of things start increasing in terms of productivity, demand, and supply. All of this increases GDP. This is good expenditure because whatever you spend on this, you will make manyfold that back in terms of revenues, taxation. People in the middle making money, they'll pay taxes. The people using the DFC itself will pay the railways money. There will be so many indirect ways of earning money out of this entire thing for the government that this is actually good expenditure. It actually benefits the lives of Indians. That's what governments exist for. So I think this is one of the reasons why I think government expenditure is actually a good thing in some times, and therefore you should not evaluate this expenditure as saying, oh, you know what, they're spending so much on the dedicated freight corridor, it'll take 8 years to come. So what if it takes 8 years? 8 years is okay because we're all going to live beyond 8 years for the most part, and we should plan to, or if we don't, our next generation will.
Point is taken, but good expenditure I get. Subsistence expenditure, which ideally you'd be able to get out of, but we understand if there are pressures, you have to keep people functioning right now. There's nothing you can do on that. But one thing which I think I really want to bring the conversation to is that 8% number. If you're pending 8% in interest on the 1 lakh crores, and so how much was it?
8 lakh crores a year.
8 lakh crores a year on interest. That's not so nice, and that doesn't feel like desirable expenditure at all.
It is not. In fact, if you think about it, the government shouldn't be paying 8% when none of us are getting 8% at some level. And the government pays 8% because it borrowed at times when the coupon rates were relatively high. You could replace that by saying, listen, let's at one time move this expenditure over and say, let's transition the old rates to the new rates. Now, the new rates are also not very low. What's happened because of this increased government borrowing plan is that people have gotten spooked and said, oh my God, how are we going to finance this? I mean, this is crazy, man. We can't have the government borrowing so much from the market. And maybe it's time to come to a point where these 8% number has to be reduced. If not by the market itself, then perhaps by policy, perhaps by RBI. Because what does RBI do? It controls the interest rates in the economy. How is it controlling the interest rates if the most safe borrowing, which is the government's borrowing, is actually trading at a much higher yield than anything else that the non-government people can get at? Which means at 6% for 10 years. There are barely a few banks that offer that kind of rate. In fact, almost nobody offers a 10-year deposit.
Yeah.
And even if they do, they offer it at 5.5, 5.75. For senior citizens, they may offer at 6, 6.5. But essentially what we're saying is that the government itself is borrowing it more than maybe the regular public can. And perhaps the regular public is willing to accept. And at longer terms, which is the 40-year cycles, The government's actually paying closer to 7%, which is ridiculous. So I think there are ways to mitigate this, and we'll come
Yeah,
to that.
I think that was one place where you were very happy with the budget because it has clearly given some meaningful thought to how we can potentially mitigate this.
Yeah, I mean, though of course they have not done a few things I thought we'd expect. But let me give you this, three ways, if you may, that the government can finance a deficit. So one of the first ways to finance a deficit is that we've got the RBI at one level, and the RBI is one of the biggest parts of our financial system. It's a very key part of the financial system, as is the Fed in the US. Now, what has QE meant in the West? In the West, they said we'll maintain low rates, so they go to the market and actually buy bonds in order to bring the rates down. I mean, of course, they don't say it's in order to bring the rates down, but effectively that's what they do. India, at the same time, can have a similar concept by the RBI where it says, listen, RBI could intervene in the market in order to bring rates down, not because they want to own government bonds or whatever. But the simple point is this: if interest rates for government bonds are high, that means interest rates for corporates are going to remain even higher. Government can't borrow at a cheaper rate than a corporate can. So any corporate who's looking at longer term loans is simply not getting anything cheap. And we've talked in our first version of our podcast, our first edition of our podcast, about how India is this extremely high cost of capital country.
We should print shirts with that on. We say this so often.
Yes. We keep saying high cost of capital, but we're a country that needs lower cost of capital. The RBI has a stated policy saying we will have lower costs of capital, but they refuse to actually follow through and say that this is what's happening. And so, according to me, the RBI should go in and say, listen, I don't care if the short-term interest rates are low. I want even the longer-term interest rates to be lower. The Fed has done this in the past. The ECB does this all the time. Japanese central bank also will do it. But the point is simple. Interest rates need to be lower, which means you need to get them to 4.5%, or even lower, to be able for this country to be able to say, listen, it's okay. We can now. How can you do this? The RBI can buy bonds. The RBI can and will and does buy bonds. To give you an example, it has 40 lakh crores, $550 billion in US. US, well, they call it forex reserves, but assume most of that money is used to buy US bonds and East European bonds and so on. The amount of Indian bonds that it has, 13 lakh crores. We are 1/3 that the RBI, India's own central bank, owns of. I have no grudge against them owning 40 lakh crores of forex reserves. They use whatever you want, I don't care. But you can't say that because I have that, I can't buy government bonds. That makes no sense whatsoever. And the government bonds percentage as a percentage of the RBI balance sheet has been roughly the same even for the last 5 years. Why not increase that? Because you've had a corona, you know that the quality of expenditure is improving. You need to increase this and reduce the burden on the government in some way. The RBI has one of the biggest balance sheets of the country, and I'll come to that at a later point. But biggest equity as a percentage of the balance sheet, I think equity is about 35%. But the point is, the balance sheet is expanding. Balance sheet is expanding at an alarming rate. We've printed about 8 lakh crores more last year.
But where's this going? I mean, if we're not buying our own debt, where is this going?
It's coming back to the RBI because the RBI gives it to banks. Banks say we can't lend anymore. Banks park it back to the RBI at 3.35%, and everybody's happy. But the point is this: until people actually lend. Now, the fear of RBI printing is inflation, right?
Eventually, if the government feels that it only needs the RBI to buy its debt and doesn't have to deal with the market, yes, then at some point, right now you may be happy with both the government and the RBI to some extent, but eventually you can't perhaps have that level of trust. So if the government continues, what's the word? They say monetize its debt through the RBI, that could eventually lead to a state where the interest rates spiral out of control.
Yes, I think, or inflation spirals out of control. But I think we've had this in the past. We've had till 1999 or so, RBI directly buying government debt. You shouldn't buy government debt directly. It should buy it in the market. The idea is to reduce market interest rates, not to reduce the cost of the government. You want to reduce market interest rates by saying that the government needs to pay less in order for private citizens to pay less, or private corporates to pay less. So your idea is that, not to say that I'm going to directly buy from the government. Don't directly buy from the government, buy from the market. And it's a better way. This is the only way. It is on the prescribed way that the West has done it. And I don't care what the credit rating agencies say, but we are really doing exactly what the West is doing. And we should be doing that. We shouldn't be afraid of it. And therefore, the RBI needs to print more, both by primary and secondary. When I say primary and secondary, it means primary means the, let's say, auctions. When there are auctions of government bonds, RBI sells bonds. RBI, on the other hand, has auctions where it buys government bonds. So these two auctions are separate things. So in the auctions, it announces, I'm buying 20,000 crore of government bonds. Please come and tell me your bids. That's one way to do it. Other way is to go directly to the market and say, listen, are you willing to sell me this at 100 rupees? I'll buy it. Or what's next? 101 rupees? I'm willing to buy that as well. So if they go and do that, and they've done this last week alone, when the yields spiked, the RBI went in and there was an extra auction of 22,000 crores or 20,000 crores. So because of which the yields went to 6.1% or so. The RBI said, listen, I'm not comfortable with that. There was a bond auction failure. The yields continue to spike up. So what the RBI did next week was to go and quickly buy up 25,000 crores worth of bonds in one day. This is exactly the way they should be doing things. They shouldn't announce what they're doing beforehand, but they should say, my stated goal is to keep the interest yields low. Because if I have my short-term yields at 3.35, how can my long-term yields be 6.1? That makes no sense whatsoever. So if you guys are going to drive up long-term yields because of whatever fears you have, I have no problem. I'm going to come in and buy. And I'm going to bring the yields down to whatever level I think is comfortable. This is perfectly fine for the RBI to say. And if the RBI thinks something is going out of hand, then they have the ability to act. They do this with the USD INR all the time. Now, if they were allowing markets to determine everything, then they should allow the markets to determine the USD INR as well. If people feel that they have a problem with the RBI intervening in interest rates, then they should have a problem in RBI intervening in market rates as well. Because we're not going to get one when we should not get the other. So, if my point is this, either leave it as a completely market-run economy or decide what you want on everything. Markets are not, and RBI is a player. RBI needs to own government bonds because that is how it prints more money, and it should use that mechanism to print money rather than buy USD to print money in order for the country to grow. Because in the end, the RBI's balance sheet has to be strong. I mean, has to be not strong. Well, has to be backed by some asset. We should have more of those as Indian assets than foreign assets. We have gold. We don't even have the gold in India. Most of the RBI gold is not even in India. It's kept outside of India, and they turn yellow in their pants if everybody asks them to bring the gold back to India. Why don't you have more Indian assets? It's not like people complain about this and say, oh no, but foreigners they won't accept their money back in Indian rupees. Yeah, of course they will, man. They come here, they're the ones who invest in stuff that has Indian rupees. They're not investing because the RBI will pay them back. They're investing because it's a free market to that extent, and that when they want their money back, they can get it. So they put more money in as they want. Just because the RBI has lower, more rupees in comparison to the ratio of dollars that they have, they're not going to run away. I think the RBI is perfectly fine to print, and if it does, there will be a reduction of market requirements. So if, for instance, they did 25,000 crores last week. If they do something like 2 lakh crores, that's not going to be much. I told you, 13 lakh crores is the amount that the RBI owns in government bonds. 40 lakh crores is the amount the RBI owns of US and other country bonds. So you bring the 13 to 16, let's say. So that's 3 lakh crores more. You add 3 lakh crores, it's going to reduce the market requirements from 9 lakh crores net to 6 lakh crores net.
That's a third gone.
It's the third gone right now, and it doesn't change the RBI equation very much. And this is one of those special years when you have to do it, and I'll tell you why. Because one of the reasons the deficit is so high is because revenues are low. So if you look at the corporation taxes this year, they're about 5.47 lakh crores, 547,000 crores, versus 2019-20. Now remember, this is 2 years back when they first cut corporate rates. Taxes collected were actually 5.5 lakh crores. So essentially, we are lower taxes in this coming year
Than 2 years ago.
That's because the intermediate year
Had
of
all those
Corona
losses, I guess.
had losses.
Okay.
So people are going to use the profits of next year to offset those losses and therefore pay lower taxes. What does this mean? That the subsequent year after that, they won't have any losses left to offset, and therefore you will have a much higher tax collection. Again, good revenue, because you may be taking a 1 year hit, but eventually your revenue is good. So personal taxes on the other hand have gone up, because you've got 42% taxes at one level, we've got dividends being taxed, we've got a bunch of other things. So they do expect that personal taxes will grow up by about 20-25%, which I think they are seeing anyways, regardless of what we look at. We're seeing personal taxes being paid at a much higher level. The last part, of course, is GST. Now, GST, they collect about 1 lakh crores a month, 12 lakh crores a year. Half of that goes to the states, and then we're left with about 6 lakh crores for the government. So about, if you consider personal income taxes at about 6 lakh crores, GST at about 6 lakh crores, and corporation tax at about 5 lakh crores, that's 17 lakh crores. They make money in a couple of other ways. Petrol taxes, yeah, that's massive, because that's about 33,000 crores a month. They're not going to give that easy. And remember, this is nearly doubled last year. So when crude goes up, we do have a problem. But they do make a fair amount on petrol and diesel, and that's another big source of income. They make a little bit on customs, 1,30,000 crores. That's not a huge amount. But one more other area that they've actually seen a interesting impact is of where the disinvestment comes.
Yeah.
So the disinvestment is interesting, because disinvestment is where the big part of government revenues come in. Now, it's more like one-time-ish kind of revenues, but the government owns so much that it would keep disinvesting for the next 6 years, and it would be a continuous stream of revenue. They want about 2 lakh crores, a little bit less than 2 lakh crores in disinvestment receipts. But you see they're disinvesting from LIC this year. That will allow them to get some
That should be a
money.
big one.
That should be a big one. The second one is BPCL. BPCL alone should be worth 75,000 crores. So that's a fairly big number. And I say 75,000 crores, it's about 50% of BPCL. Values that company at 1.5 lakh crores. Okay, forget 75. Let's say 50,000.
Yeah.
Valued at about 1 lakh crores. For a company that has this kind of retail reach, so many petrol stations that it owns, that it has as distributors, it has a refining arm, it has marketing arm, it has cooking gas, it has a bunch of other products. So it literally is a behemoth, and you're valuing it at just less than $15 billion. It sounds ridiculous. And remember, I mean, many of these things, the debt to equity ratios are so low that they can further leverage and massively increase their footprint without too much effort. So you have that lever, that one lever where you say, if I put in some more money, I could get 4x returns. You don't get it right now because of unions, government ownership, all that stuff. But give it to a private player, and all that stuff vanishes, and you have productivity benefits that are much higher. So I think the government should retain a little bit of ownership, but because so that it can benefit from the future gains, and see how bad it's running its own PSUs. But and at the same time, sell most of it. You'll get disinvestment receipts this year. Now, this is revenue. This is all good, right? But RBI can also give revenue. So that's another part that I was talking about, is RBI not just buys bonds, but RBI's balance sheet contains these 40 lakh crores of dollars that it has bought over time.
Yeah.
Now, RBI is one of the most conservative banks in the world, in the sense that it has one of the largest equity ratios in its balance sheet. So for every 100 rupees that it has on its balance sheet in terms of size, it has about 30 to 35 rupees of equity. This is ridiculous. People have known it is ridiculous, and everybody's scared to tell the RBI. And even the RBI is like, okay, listen, if I'm allowed to keep this money, it's retained profits.
Okay.
Profits that RBI makes, it retains.
All right.
Now, RBI makes a lot of money. It retains most of it and gives the government some dividend, 50,000 crores, 60,000 crores, and so on. But it makes much more than that. And I'll tell you how much. Okay, so the equity percentage of the RBI balance sheet is about 30-35%. They constituted a committee to say how much is optimal. Okay, they said between 18 and 25%. So we take about 22.5%. That's still 10% of RBI's balance sheet, which would be about 10 lakh crores. That is extra. I mean, it is just way too high or way too big a balance sheet. And there are many ways you can take it out. So, for instance, you assume that what forms part of that balance sheet is simply that the government has, the RBI has bought dollars over time. Sometimes it bought dollars when the rupee was 40. So it owned $1, and on the liability side, it has a rupee at 40 rupees. So it has a dollar which is 40 rupees, and liability side rupee, so the asset is 40, liability is 40. But the rupee went to 75. So the asset side went to 75. What happened on the liability side? So they created something called a reserve. This is a profit because it's mark to market, but it's not a profit they've realized. So they call it a currency translation, currency revaluation reserve. Okay. But it's really profit. So if you sold the dollar and bought it back, you would have the profit. It's a realized profit if you sell it and buy it back. So this is an extra item on this extra item has ballooned up to 8 lakh crores. Now you have 40 lakh crores in dollars, 8 lakh crores in the forex translation reserve. Why do you need it? Oh, listen, if the rupee appreciates, then the RBI will lose money. Yes, of course. But how much should it appreciate? I don't know. So 75, will the RBI let it go to 60? Probably not. It's too much. It's going to hurt too much. So RBI is going to aggressively buy dollars if the RBI rupee start to appreciate so much. So 75 can become 72, maybe 70, maybe 65, but I don't think they'll allow it to go to 60. So if you say that, listen, 20% is too much, 15% is okay. That's 5% of holdings. That's 1/4 of the current reserve, which is 8 lakh crores currently, can go down to 6 lakh crores. Take the 2 lakh crores out. You can easily engineer this. Just sell a few dollars and buy it back instantly. And you have this 2 lakh crores of realized profits that you can pay to the government as a dividend. You're just saying, I'm reducing the size of the balance sheet according to the committee that was constituted to figure out how big the RBI balance sheet should be, which told me that it should be 22.5%, but I am making it 27 instead of 35 that it is right now. So I can then give 2 lakh crores from this currency translation reserve. The second big reserve is something called a contingency reserve. Now, I don't understand this because a central bank in India or in the world is very special. The central banks is the only institution where a rupee is a liability, not an asset. So the rupees that it prints is a liability for the balance sheet, but any rupee owned by anybody else is an asset. On the RBI balance sheet, anytime there's a crisis, it prints more rupees. What does it do? It expands its balance sheet. It doesn't need a contingency reserve to protect its balance sheet. It has a foreign currency translation reserve, and a foreign currency translation does not actually result in real losses anyway. So there's nothing that can harm RBI's balance sheet, which can, in any crisis, the RBI only increases it. So why does it need a contingency reserve? Because the RBI is distrusting of the government. And at this point, I see no reason for us to trust the RBI more than we trust the government, to be honest. And I feel that the RBI should not. In many other countries, they don't allow the central bank to own so much because the central banks have the power to keep on printing.
Yeah.
They say, once you cross 10%, you're done.
Okay.
You have to stop. Which means you can above 10%, you have to pay any extra 10% of equity, which means if your balance sheet size is 100, if you cross 10 in equity, then anything more than 10 has to be paid to the government compulsorily as a dividend. And the government says, listen, if you're in trouble, I'll back you, don't worry. Which means the government will borrow money from the market in order to finance its equity of the RBI if required. It is never required. No central bank in the world requires equity infusions other than like stupid bloody countries which denominate their own currency in dollars. And even, in Venezuela, you don't need central bank rescues. You need government rescues. Governments need to be rescued, not central banks. So you actually do not see I don't see a reason for this, and the government can carve out instead of 4 lakh crores. Okay, be stupid, but be stupid to the extent of only 2 lakh crores. Take out 2 from here, take out 2 from the foreign currency translation reserve. That's 4 lakh crores. I said this last April, saying this is a crisis. The government ought to get money from the RBI. There is 4 lakh crores available then, and there is now. They can pay 4 lakh crores in dividends. If that dividend goes to the government, it's not borrowing, it's revenue. So it actually makes that 400,000 crores. Okay, don't give it in 1 year, give it in 2 years. 2 lakh crores this year, 2 lakh crores next year. If you reduce 2 lakh crores this year, your net borrowing, which we brought down by saying RBI will borrow one third, will take one third of the borrowing from 9 lakh crores, bring it down to 6. Now it has to give, it will bring it down to 4. Now 4 is a point where, even a normal year would borrow 7. So 4 is much lesser than 7. So you can increase the demand, or rather reduce the supply requirement of external borrowing. External borrowing is another this thing. But this is just one way. I mean, many ways that the RBI as a single, player, uh, can dramatically change this equation for the next 1 year. And I think as a post-corona year, we absolutely deserve it.
One of the things coming into this is it's not, as just about the government and the RBI, as you had pointed out before we started recording. Now we, as just say the average citizen or the average investor, are also getting into the mix with our PF now looking a little less attractive, and G6 directly available to citizens. So in a sense, they're playing with the demand generation at the individual level as well. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so if you look at government securities, who are they bought by? Largely banks, because banks, when you deposit 100 rupees into the bank has to take about 16, 17, 18, I don't know what the number is right now, but something called SLR. This is a statutory liquidity ratio which tells banks that they have to have at least a certain percentage of all their assets, all their deposits in government bonds. So that means for every 100 rupees you give a bank, about 15, 19, 20, whatever the number is, has to go straight to government bonds. So that's a natural demand for government bonds. There's also insurance companies which are required to have a certain amount in government bonds. There are pension plans, provident funds, mutual funds, liquid funds, for instance, that need to have. So this is institutional demand for government securities. Now, some part of that will change. So, for instance, as you said, people will get taxed on the amounts they put into their provident funds above 2.5 lakh crores a year, 2.5 lakh rupees a year,
which is like just 20-22 a month, right?
Which is 20 to 22,000 rupees a
so
month.
That actually makes this significantly less attractive, right?
Yes. So apparently last year 62,000 crores was this number where people had put in more than 2.5 lakh rupees per month. So that amount amounted to 62,000.
So a lot of that will probably start reducing, fairly quickly.
Assuming that goes to zero, it may not, but because still may be okay. But assuming that goes to zero, that's 62,000 crores less available to buy government bonds. Assuming that they bought other bonds with 10,000 crores, you have about 50,000 crore lower demand, so which can also spike up yields next year. This actually is a weird problem. So what will happen now is that that reduction has to be offset by something else.
Yeah.
Now, what is that something else? Say you look at ULIPs, insurance policies which are linked to the market, where you say that above 2.5 lakhs will not be allowed to be called tax free at maturity. So what this does is dramatically reduce the attraction for ULIPs. But what will insurance companies do? Offer more traditional policies. More traditional policies require a higher component of government securities. ULIPs usually invest in the market. So traditional policies, since they require more government securities, will have naturally a higher demand for. So you might balance out one versus the other. But institutional demand, I don't think, is going up very dramatically. But there's another interesting part. So let's look at the two other areas beyond the Indian institutions: foreign institutions or foreign players, and Indian retail. So foreign institutions, India already has a limit that says you can't buy more than so much, but the foreigners are so much below their limit that it's not funny.
Okay.
But there's also a reason for that. If you want to buy a foreign institution, you have to buy with at least 3 years left to maturity. And then if you buy something that's 4 years left to maturity and it goes, 1 year passes, then you have to think about who you can sell it to, because you may not be able to sell it to another foreign institution, or you can't sell it down to one of your other funds because it's at a lower maturity. So all these complications make people think, dude, we don't want this headache. We'll just go buy Korean bonds. It doesn't matter because they don't have all these restrictions. So the foreign institutions are not really interested unless we dramatically reduce regulation, and we should.
As you said, this is politics in a sense, or you're dealing with other sentiments. So
yes, so it's not. So then India could issue dollar securities abroad. Now, again, this is a political hot
This
potato.
one too. Okay.
Because they'll say, oh, we're selling India to the foreigners. We're not. Out of the 110 lakh crores that the government borrows, about 6 lakh crores is borrowed abroad through some multilateral, bilateral loans and so on. Very little from market bonds. So why don't we issue dollar bonds abroad? Just 1 lakh crores. I'm not talking about a huge amount. 1 lakh crores would be 1% of this government borrowing, 0.5% of GDP, almost nothing. And it will reduce our burden by maybe, I don't know, if you brought it down to, say 9 lakh crores, it's reduced our borrowing burden from local to by 10%. So, and if you're saying the RBI is also going to participate in some, it's going to reduce it by a lot more. But no, there'll be so many arguments. In India, even if you build a policy that's good, people will protest. They will put dharna outside Delhi and sit there for years.
Well, this one Bombay, na, RBI.
RBI is Bombay. I don't know when they might put it somewhere, maybe Jaipur somewhere, or But the problem really is that you can't. The political nature of the country is that you will have crazy levels of protests for absolutely no reason whatsoever, or people will invent reasons, but this is good. Borrowing abroad is unilaterally good at this level. 1 lakh crores, 5 lakh crores also will not change the equation for India. We have enough forex reserves and more than enough lack of productivity. When I say lack of productivity, means we don't have productivity. Tomorrow, if we increase productivity, the gains are so huge that the ability for us to return money is enormous compared to most other countries which are aging or which have matured. But those are the countries that are borrowing a lot. But we won't do it. And that's also because we are shit scared of rating agencies and they should be made irrelevant. Like we've talked in another podcast.
We'll link to that.
Yes. But interestingly, this is only one layer.
Yeah, I was very interested in the one like me. I mean, people like me or all our customers who we migrate out of fixed deposits into this. As you're saying, you're lending to your bank or you're putting money in your bank at what, 4.5%, or even lower as our customers are. You're actually saying I can just bypass this whole middleman, which is the banking system, and directly lend to the government at 6+ or 6, something close to 6.
And most countries allow their citizens to do that. Why do we need banks to invest in government bonds? Because the retail participant cannot. Why do I need to? So, for instance, nobody in India, no bank in India offers 40-year loans. I'm 45 years old. I would love to have a 40-year stream of income predetermined.
Like an annuity.
But if I go to an LIC or an insurance company, which is the only one that's available to offer me an annuity, they give me 4.5%, 5% net. And that's taxable. So it's like I'm paying you money and then you're going to give me 5% back for an illiquid annuity. Illiquid meaning that if I want to get some more money than you're giving me, I have no way to do that. Whereas why don't I just go buy a government bond? And it's a 40-year bond. I can keep getting payments every year. And if I want to sell it in the middle, I can sell a little more of it whenever I want it. Those 40-year bonds are trading close to 7%. No bank is offering you 7% or anywhere close to it. What this will do is dramatically reduce people's reliance on fixed deposits and instead start moving money. And according to me, every rich person, I'm saying whose net worth is say more than 20-25 crores, has a certain amount of money they want for preservation. So they put this money into, I don't know, maybe sometimes debt mutual funds, sometimes fixed deposits. They should just put this money into 40-year deposits with the government. Yes, you're getting some income. And perhaps
and
you need
therefore
it
you end up paying some tax on that, unfortunately.
Yes, and you need the income anyway because people who have 25 crores plus may not have regular incomes on the other hand. They might use the money itself to get income. This is a great way to get income even if it's taxable. And it makes your money safe. So safe from credit risks or anything that happens. You know that the government will always pay back, and India has never defaulted in its history. I don't think it ever will. But here is where I think this will change the game, because if you allow retail to access deposits directly now, could you have done it earlier? It was very complicated. You could participate in auctions through brokers, but you couldn't sell what you had bought. What's the point of that? Second, you had your bonds in a demat system. Now the government actually has created two separate bodies. One is the RBI for managing the bond market, and SEBI for regulating the equity market, but also part of the bond market, and so it's quite complicated. So the government has actually said, listen, we're going to make this a single regulation for both government securities and SEBI. So SEBI is most likely going to be the player that regulates both government securities and the bond and equity markets. RBI is kind of feeling this pinch. Until now, they've maintained a separate system called Securities General Ledger for government bonds, whereas SEBI has moved everybody into a DMAT system, which
got
is a DMAT provider, this thing and so on. So RBI said, listen, we're feeling the lack of power over here, but we're going to make this easier for the retail to directly
Got it.
invest. So they're opening up retail investments into government securities, which means you'll have to create a separate account. It's not a DMAT account, but you'll directly buy from the RBI. And RBI will directly pay you, or the government will directly pay your bank account. You know what this changes? It's very interesting, because when a bank buys a government bond,
Yeah,
it gets maybe 7% interest.
sure.
It pays almost no tax on that 7% interest, because it's allowed to offset the interest it earns from the government bonds by the interest it pays on its deposits.
So which is maybe what, 3.5 or something?
So let's say they get deposits at 5%. They borrow from the government. I mean, they get that's 7% from the government. So they pay tax only on the 2% minus their expenses.
Got it.
So net they might pay a tax on only 1%.
So that's vanishingly little. Yeah.
So if we consider a 25% tax, we're talking of 25 paisa tax on 7 rupees earned, which is.
Well, not a great deal for the government.
But if you and I buy bonds,
Well, we painfully pay a lot, right?
let's
Almost
say,
3 rupees.
yeah, let's say we pay 30%. Okay. So 7% ka 2 rupees 10 paisa.
Yeah.
So 25 paisa from a bank, 2 rupees 10 paisa from me. The effective cost to the government of a 7% bond on which they collect 25 paisa tax is 6.75. The effective cost to the government for a 7% bond they pay you and me is 4.9, because we can't offset it against anything. So technically, we should be in. It's a better proposition to give it to people who have no way to offset that tax than to give it to people who have ways to offset it. So this is also another way where the government can actually reduce its effective borrowing costs by earning
Yeah.
more revenue on this money. So this is also a good thing. And the fact is that you can lock in your money for 40 years. This is an amazing development. What it does is increase demand for government securities, and at the same time give you all these little benefits which you otherwise didn't have.
No, this completely makes sense. As I said, I mean, it is truly safer than your fixed deposit. It's not the most tax efficient, but as you said, sometimes you just do have to bite the bullet.
There may be ways to make it tax efficient. The government's already talking about infrastructure bonds that they will make as what is called zero coupon, which means
okay.
you pay 100, you get 1,000 at the end of say 20 years, but you pay no taxes until you get that 1,000
Got
rupees,
it.
and that 1,000 rupees is. So if government actually said, listen, for our infrastructure requirements, we'll issue those infrastructure bonds which are tax free till the end. So out of that 900,000 crores that they plan to borrow, they issue 200,000 crores worth of infrastructure bonds. Suddenly, retail becomes super excited at this, buys all of them. The banking system doesn't have to, because banking system doesn't care about tax free and all that stuff. And suddenly, you have a much lesser load on the banking system to buy government bonds. So you could do that as well, and that's going to be another layer that's going to be directly available to the government. It won't be government bonds; it'll be issued through an infrastructure institution like IIFCL or something like that. But whatever it is, it's borrowing, and they're talking of a bad bank. They're talking all these things need to borrow. So if those borrowings come at a lower rate, then you have a much more stable financial system. Of course, I would personally prefer to own directly securities from the government, because having one layer removed is not as useful as just having securities directly from the government. Remember also that these securities are super liquid. So if you could go, and even if you can't sell them in the market, you can go to a bank and say, give me a loan against this. The bank will give you 90 rupees of every 100 rupees of government bonds you own almost instantly, because banks love government bonds as a and they love it as security, because they know that no matter what happens, there's no default on it.
Now, I think this is a surprisingly optimistic podcast, but I'll say I do have one caveat here. All of the stuff you've said is all contingent on low inflation. So if inflation, we're not able to control it or whatever, that then destroys all of this, right? This whole argument doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So this is where, my views have changed. I used to think, when the RBI prints, it'll cause inflation. But then we've got no inflation or next to no inflation. Why? What's happened? In the last 10 years, when the US and the West have printed so much money, what are the biggest companies in the world? Apple, Microsoft,
Amazon.
None of them have meaningful amounts of debt. Most of them are cash rich to the point where their debt is very, very small as a percentage of their cash holdings. So You have businesses which have very little debt becoming the biggest thing in a time when the cost of debt is next to zero. What's happening really? It's because low interest rates fuel productivity. And when you have productivity benefits, the companies that earn the most money out of that are companies with high operating leverages, who therefore don't need debt or wipe away their debt over time. So effectively, you're reaching a point where debt is not going to make things more attractive, but essentially is going to make risk taking more attractive. And when you take risks, you increase productivity. When you increase productivity, you reduce prices. I've talked about DFC as one of the examples, but the idea is the same. You will always see reduced productivity when you have an inefficient organization. But if you make it more efficient, anything in the system more efficient, you dramatically reduce prices. At a very basic level, if I had a country which was making 100, I don't know, widgets, and we all survived on widgets, and there was only 100 rupees out there, the max you could pay is 1 rupee per widget, because that's the whole money supply. If tomorrow somebody built a fantastic system that said from 100 I can make 200 widgets, so I increase productivity 2x, what would happen? There was only 100 rupees to pay for the 200 widgets. So prices would go down. So for the same money supply, an increase in productivity means prices come down. So when you have 200 widgets for only 100 rupees available, you'll have a price fall from 1 rupee per widget to 0.50 paisa per widget. So you'd actually increase productivity, reduces prices. So what the central bank typically does is prints money to offset it. So when they print money, they make it 200 rupees in money supply, and then 200 widgets. So you got the price remaining the same. Now our productivity gains have been insane and huge and enormous. Look at like say mobile phones. Phones have become cheaper. The cost of calling has become cheaper. You don't pay for half the things you used to pay 10 years ago in the mobile telephony market. The internet costs, access costs have reduced quite dramatically.
Sending money has become
Sending money has become cheaper and easier and faster. Sending goods has become easier and faster. You got more logistics companies now than you had earlier. And all of this, including more infrastructure, roads, trains, dedicated freight corridors, better internet connectivity, all this contribute to reducing prices over time. Now, inflation can only go up, for instance, if the demand for money is so much more than the supply of goods. But if supply of goods is increasing at a dramatic pace, then the demand for money, even if it increases at some point, it may get offset by the increase in supply. But demand for money is also not going up quite dramatically. Look at how money is created. Money, RBI prints money, it goes to a bank which multiplies it. RBI has printed a lot of money. That money is just coming back to the RBI and sitting there on its balance sheet because the banks are saying we don't want to lend. Why do they not want to lend? Again, because some of the bigger companies in India are slowly getting to a point where they don't want money as debt, because they're realizing productivity benefits and paying down their debt. The total debt in India on the corporate basis has not increased since 2015, and not dramatically increased. It is maybe 5% in 5 years. This is insane, because you've never had a 5-year period in India where debt levels did not go up at least 5 or 10% a year. But the total debt borrowed, even a Reliance, has become net debt free. It can't become debt free, because if it became debt free, the banking system would shudder and fall at Ambani's feet. Because if Ambani pays back his loans, where's that money going to go? And nobody else is there to borrow it. So Ambani has cash and Ambani has debt. So he keeps the banks happy, and the banks, of course, have to keep him happy in some way. But it's not Ambani, of course, it's Reliance. The point over here is this: it's this factor, this increased money availability drives productivity and drives higher productive companies to repay their debt and therefore not require debt, and therefore debt levels don't go up. If debt levels don't go up, the money supply does not increase. So if the money supply does not increase, there is no velocity of money, which means you're not going to get inflation. If the supply of money is growing at a moderate pace, but the supply of goods is increasing at a dramatic pace, even if the demand of goods goes up, it is not going to cause inflation in any meaningful way, because you can see that if the demand of goods is very high, the demand of money would go up. And demand of money is not going up in India, it's not going up in the US, and it's the first time this is happening in India, though the US has seen this footprint 10 years ago. If 10 years, we are 10 years behind them. We've started our printing cycles now. When we when we've seen what the US has seen in the last 10 years, that there's been no inflation there, I don't think we're going to see any inflation here, apart from, of course, some massive catastrophe that happens in the West that causes interest rates to rise dramatically over there. I can tell you this, if the West sees a rising dramatic in interest rates, the West is finished. Japan is bankrupt beyond imagination at 3% interest rates. Beyond imagination. It means Japan's entire government revenue will not be able to be
Pay the interest.
pay just the interest.
Got it.
We say 8 lakh crores out of 34 is
Yeah.
bad. They will be paying 34 out of 34 if their interest rates rise to 3%. In fact, I think it's 2.5 now. So you can't have rising rates in the West. It's not going to happen. And if it's not going to happen, nothing's going to happen in India as well. So if it happens, the whole world's coming crashing down. You know what? We're going to be part of that world, and we're going to be part of that world whether we have high interest rates or low. So we might as well use this opportunity to say, listen, let's build a better country. And, if the world goes down, we go down with it, and that's the risk we take.
What a not so positive, but kind of risk-taking note to end on. But I do actually get your point. And maybe I would just say one thing in parting. In the rest of the world, as you said, there's no alternative basically to the stock market or to directly investing in equities. But we, at least in India, maybe for the next, couple of years or 5 years at most, we do have a bit of an alternative with a somewhat reasonably interesting debt.
Yes. In fact, the government debt is the most interesting because that's the point where you're getting 7% almost risk free now, 7.2% perhaps on state government loans, almost risk free. I don't think we'll find it easy to see these times again. There were times when the government bonds used to yield 10%. I remember those times. I remember those times fondly. But I don't think we see those times in any meaningful format. But debt is going to be interesting because debt will give us equity like returns if what I'm saying comes true. That if our rates fall to
Yeah.
3-4%, we will actually see dramatically lower numbers, and we will long for those 7% rates that we are talking about in in what seems like, okay, that's a nice number to have today. People always crib about the fact that the older citizens have problems because they, if you reduce interest rates, what's going to happen to them? But you know what? The government has made sure that if you have about 30 to 40 lakh rupees, that you can buy senior citizen level schemes for as much as nearly 8%, 7.5, 7.75%. So they are safe, and that's only for senior citizens. I think interest rates ought to come down for everybody else. We're a young country. We need lower interest rates. We've talked about this many times on the cost of capital. But I want to put it in context of the government borrowing. That the only way you can cause interest rates to fall is that the government has to borrow at a much lower rate. And if that happens, this 2021 year will be watershed for bonds, not just for equities.
And that's a good note to end on. So thank you very much, Deepak. And I'm setting yearly reminders to remind you of your predictions to see how they pan out. So we'll see how it goes.
Let's see that. And lovely to have all of you here. Thanks, Shray, and thanks everyone for listening.
Bye-bye.